Hello and welcome to the CIBSE West Midlands region webinar and seminar on Legionella risk assessments. Legionella risk assessments are nothing new. The need to complete these risk assessments has been around for decades. The standard and quality of these risk assessments can vary greatly. Our briefing session today will last around 30 to 45 minutes and reiterates the need for Legionella risk assessments and how they're required under the regulations and guidance documents. In 2010, the British Standards Institute issued BS8580 Water Quality Risk Assessments for Legionella Control Code of Practice. For the first time, a published standard on what is a Legionella risk assessment should be included. In 2019, British Standards issued an update to the British Standard, further refining the standards for these risk assessments. With an understanding of the defined requirements within the standard, the delegates, you will be able to objectively review your current risk assessments and determine how suitable and compliant they are with BS8580. Peter Tyson from Water Hygiene Centre, our speaker this morning, is Senior Development Consultant for the Water Hygiene Centre and has extensive experience of water systems and waterborne pathogens. With 20 years in the water treatment and hygiene industry, Peter's worked as a services engineer, sales engineer, regional manager and regional director for some major water hygiene companies within the industry. His experience is gleaned from being involved in the Legionella outbreak in 2002 at Barrow, Cumbria, to managing contracts at nuclear power stations, to presenting role of the responsible person training. His experience and knowledge of specific areas bridges many market sectors. Pete was co-author of the article published for the Chartered Institution of Environmental Health discussing COVID-19, return to work and the actions to be undertaken on businesses reopening. It's great to have you, Pete. Thank you very much. And we look forward to hearing what you have to share with us this morning. Thank you.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thanks for the introduction, guys, and thanks for attending. Well, we've just had a great overview there of British Standard risk assessments, the requirement for risk assessments, and I'd like to thank you all for allowing me to talk about risk assessments in the British Standard 8580. And as mentioned before, I've got 25 years experience. It's gone up a few years since that narrative was given, and I've got some water safety risk experience, and it's an area that we feel is often overlooked as a ticking box exercise or a box ticking exercise. And in fairness, this is the reason why the British Standard has been introduced, to make sure that there's other things other than a box ticking exercise have been undertaken. And there is the Water Hygiene Centre are one of only 13 accredited companies to deliver UCAS risk assessments which comply with the British Standard 8580. So we've got a bit of understanding of what these risk assessments should look like. And what the topics that we're going to cover today are Legionella risk assessments. Why are they needed? The British Standard 8580 2019, what does it include? Do your risk assessments comply? And some key points to take away. So why do we need to have a risk assessment? Well, the HSE website details some of those requirements, and the Management of Health and Safety at Work regulations in 1999 require employers to put in place arrangements to control health and safety risks. And as a minimum, you should have the processes and procedures required to meet the legal requirements. And those things include a written policy, assessments of the risks to employees, contractors, customers, partners, and any other people who could be affected by your activities. And they should be recording the significant findings in writing. Any risk assessment must be suitable and sufficient. And we're going to come over what does a suitable and sufficient risk assessment look like. We should have arrangements for the effective planning, organisation, control, monitoring, and review of the preventative and protective measures that come from said risk assessment. We should have access to competent health and safety advice that can be in-house, externally, for example, subcontractors or consultants. We should provide employees with information about the risks in the workplace and how they are protected. We should provide instruction and training for employees in how to deal with the risks. We should ensure that there is adequate and appropriate supervision in place, consulting with employees about their risks at work and current preventative protective measures, for example. So this slide is a real key slide. covers a lot of aspects of why we need a risk assessment. And it's quite an exhaustive list, and we're going to go over another exhaustive list in a little while. But there's also that hierarchy of control, and you guys are probably going to tell me that I'm missing one in here, which is engineering controls. And I know I am, but I've not made those necessary changes just yet. So we've got a hierarchy of control and COSH. And does Legionella bacteria come under COSH regulations and the management of COSH? Well, we don't buy it, we don't store it, we don't want it, but it is part of the process of managing that water system when it becomes our water system, as opposed to the utility provider or river water or whatever it is that we're using. So it does come under COSH, and it comes under biological agent. So it is a COSH requirement that it is assessed. And what does COSH tell us to do? Well, if we have a risk, we assess the risk. We assess the risk to health arising from hazardous substances used in or created by your workplace activities. We also need to decide what precautions are needed. You must carry out work which could expose you. You should not carry out work which could expose your employees to hazardous substances without first considering the risks and the necessary precautions to be undertaken. And also, what else do you need to do to comply with COSH? We also prevent or adequately control exposure. So you must prevent your employees being exposed to hazardous substances. Where prevention exposure is not reasonably practical, then you must adequately control it. We ensure that control measures are used and maintained properly, and that safety procedures are followed. And one of the things that I do need to add into that is engineering. So can we engineer the risk out, as best possible? So, for example, if we've got a multitude of TMVs within the site, do we actually need those TMVs where it's an ideal breeding ground for bacteria, because they've got things in there like strainers, flow restrictors, etc., where it's improving or increasing the potential proliferation of waterborne pathogens? So can we engineer those things out? Can we reduce the risk? Can we take out a tank if it's no longer needed? Can we remove showers where they're no longer needed or utilised, etc.? So we need to also monitor the exposure of employees to hazardous substances. We need to carry out appropriate health surveillance where your assessment has shown that it is necessary or where COSH sets specific requirements. We also need to prepare plans and procedures to deal with accidents, incidents, emergencies involving hazardous substances where necessary, so emergency plans. And we also need to ensure that employees are properly informed, trained and supervised, and ultimately deemed as being competent. I'm going to discuss again competency at a later slide. Now, this is a document. This is the approved code of practice. Okay, so what is an approved code of practice? Well, it's not law and it's not quite guidance. It sits somewhere in the middle. It's got a quasi-legal status, a special legal status. I think all ACOPs have got this special legal status, and it's what we deem as that document that is telling you how to do things. If you can't do it exactly to the book, can you do something equal to it or better than it? And can you prove that that is ensuring that there's adequate control of that system? So there's a requirement to have a suitable and sufficient risk assessment completed, and that risk assessment must be completed by a competent person. And this is a little slide in here that's just after the next slide, sorry, but these are what the approved code of practice are deemed as being those risk systems. And there's 4 sections to this, A, B, C, D, and that is cooling systems with cooling towers, rapidly condensed or dry wet cooling systems. There's hot and cold water systems, so domestic systems. There's spa pools, and they've got their own specific guidance and documentation to adhere to. And then the final catch-all from the HSE, which is other plant and systems containing water that can create and increase the risk from Legionella during operation or when being maintained. Now that means absolutely anything else. Okay, so those 4 sections there, and it's up to the site personnel to identify those other plant and systems that contain water that can produce an aerosol or a risk. And then of course we've got to undertake the routine of the risk assessment, contamination, amplification, transmission, etc. But those things have also got to be assessed and included within the risk assessment. And then one of the common questions that we get is what is a low risk system? So there's a bit of information in the guidance document HS274 Part 2, which tells us what is a low risk system. And that is a small building where without people especially at risk from Legionella bacteria, where daily water usage is inevitable and sufficient to turn over the entire system, where cold water comes directly from a wholesome main supply, no stored water tanks, for example, and where hot water is fed from instantaneous heaters or low storage volume water heaters supplying outlets are greater than 50 degrees C, or where the only outlets are toilets and hand wash basins and no showers. Now, these are low risk systems, but they've still got to be assessed and deemed to be low risk, and that documentation has got to be there to prove it, and it's got to be regularly reviewed and included in your water safety plan, water safety groups, and all the other decision-making processes. It doesn't have to have as robust a monitoring and management system, but it does have to be regularly reviewed. Again, just in case there's been any changes to usage, any changes to the water system, any changes to personnel, key personnel, decision makers, duty holders, responsible people, etc. And also if there's involving any potential outbreaks within the area or at that specific sites, or if there's been any changes in documentation or legislation. So this is a bit of information, and this is quite outdated information now, but there's a reason behind that, and that's because during the COVID epidemic, the reporting of Legionella cases was off the radar, and they had different fish to fry. So I can fully understand why this wasn't one of the major priorities during that pandemic. And this is information, historical information for the last sort of 3 years, from 2016 to 2018 and then 2019. So COVID hit, I think, in March 2020, and we have now started to get some information back from NOIDS. So this information that you can see on the screen is from the Public Health England. We're now getting information from NOIDS from a reporting cases perspective. And as I say, that there was a period where there was no reporting of Legionella cases because there was different fish to fry. And we've got to say to ourselves, is there really a Legionella risk? And who regularly hears about Legionella outbreaks, etc., etc. And one of the questions that I get on a regular basis is it a problem? And because I'm in the industry, I think that more people understand and have knowledge on Legionella and waterborne pathogens than actually is probably credible. So I'm thinking to myself, maybe about 10–15% of people know about Legionella and understand the process of cleanliness, of keeping the hot, the cold, keeping it all moving, keeping it clean and keeping it well managed. And these are the things that, and I don't know whether that's true or not. Lots of people say it's less than 10%. I'm going to go with 10% and be happy about that. But the reason why I'm here is to try and give people that little bit of extra knowledge, understanding and rationale about why we've got to do these things properly. And there is a significant risk. The likelihood of contracting Legionella disease is quite low, but the consequence of contracting Legionella disease and showing symptoms is quite high. There's a 12% mortality rate on average, and that to me is significant. And obviously different organizations have different risk factors associated to them, from it could be a college or a school to a hospital, for example. And as we can see, during the summer months the number of cases increase, and we've got to put that down to temperature, we've got to put that down to holidays, we've got to put that down to a number of things, but there are no fixed reasons and rationale. These are just potential reasons and rationale of why the cases increase. But we know that Legionella lives between 20 and 45 degrees C, and if we can keep the temperatures cold, it becomes dormant. If we can keep it hot, it becomes killed. Okay, it starts to die off. So we want to make sure that the temperatures are within the right scope, and we're looking at holiday periods here. We're looking at hotels in foreign lands. We're looking at hotels in current lands in the UK, and we're looking at things where water is getting to a reasonable temperature where proliferation can occur. So, final stage, what does it include? What does it, I say final stage, next stage is, what does it include? The British Standard 8580. Well, there's a large list there of things that the risk assessment should cover. And the ACCLA and HSG 274 tell you that you've got to complete a risk assessment. They detail the need to have a suitable and sufficient assessment completed by a competent person. So what should this suitable and sufficient risk assessment include or consider? And this is what it should be including and considering. And as such, the risk assessments are no longer a look at the water systems in a property. They're not a condition survey. So it's not that box ticking exercise to say you've got a tank, you've got a cylinder, you've got showers. I know the next few slides I've taken some of these elements of the risk assessment. I'll explain them in a little bit more detail. And I think the key part there is it's not a drive-by, it's not a condition survey, it's not just a list of assets that you've got, it's what the other things are that we have to take into consideration. And they are the things that need to be considered, such as contamination, amplification, the transmission, the exposure, and the susceptibility of the individuals to be exposed. And it's a look at each of these parts of the process. And what I mean by that is Legionella is a naturally occurring organism. It's found in mains water at low concentrations. And how can a water system be contaminated, colonized? It's bring nutrients into a system, it's contamination by a low flow, biofilms, etc., etc. So these low levels of contamination from a mains perspective, and if we've got the ideal growing conditions within our system, such as low flow, biofilms, etc., it gives it an ideal opportunity for a great breeding ground. So it can occur, roots, and obviously we've got the amplification, the growth of Legionella within the water system. So we need somewhere warm to live with food, and the same is true with Legionella. So it needs, again, that warm water between 20 and 45 degrees C. It needs nutrients, iron oxide, for example, organic material, etc., etc. And we're now going to look at transmission. So water that contains Legionella transmitted to a human through inhalation or aspiration. But the only way that you can contract it is through inhalation or aspiration, so breathing in small droplets of water. So we're looking at indoor sprays of water from outlets or devices, outdoor systems such as cooling systems, for example, water features. And we know that those cooling towers aerosols can travel for many, many hundreds of meters in kilometers, for example. So there's a case in northern France, I think it was Aix-en-Mobile, where a lady lived 8 kilometers away, 5 miles away from the location of the outbreak, and that person had never traveled outside of the village. So there is a case that is, I'm not going to say proven, but suspected, that can travel up to 5 miles, which is a bit of a distance. And then finally, we're going to look at exposure. And we're looking at the closer to the source, the more likelihood to be exposed to atomized water, such as things like in a spa pool, for example. And there was obviously an outbreak in Stoke-on-Trent at JTF, where there was a spa pool that was a demonstrative purposes. It was turned on, turned off. There was no control parameters, no control measures, no management plan in place, and the water was continually being agitated, heated up to a specific to the temperature of the spa pool, etc., and used as for just a demonstration. And 2 people contracted Legionella disease, and unfortunately, 2 people contracted Legionella disease and unfortunately died. There was a few others that contracted Legionella disease, and thankfully they survived. But it's just to go to show that things can happen in various locations that you're not really expecting. And then obviously, finally, we've got susceptibility. And we're all susceptible, we're either more or less susceptible than others, but these need to be considered. And what we mean by that is the susceptibility of individuals varies. Susceptibility at a school, a college, university can't be the same as susceptibility at a hospital, for example, because we know that the likelihood is that people at a care facility have got immunosuppression in some way, shape or form. Potentially they're already ill. So again, the immune system is weakened, and the more going to be more potentially exposed to Legionella bacteria. And we've got to, like I say, we've got to undertake or factor in occupant susceptibility. And then we're going to look at competence. So let's have a look at competence of a risk assessor. I mentioned it earlier, and the risk assessors should provide evidence that they have undertaken the necessary training appropriate to the type and the complexity of the system and the risks assessment required, and gained practical experience with a competent assessor. So it's like, would you get on a bus if the driver didn't have a license? We need to ensure that the assessor is competent to complete the risk assessment at your particular facility, and they've gained sufficient experience in the complexity, the type of the system, and they've proven to have been trained by a previously competent assessor or a competent assessor. And individuals commissioning risk assessments should establish the relevant competence of an assessor prior to appointment. And this information should be readily available. So assessors should have their competence formally assessed, and their organisations that require employees of service providers to do this. such as the LCA's a code of conduct for service providers and the UCAS accreditation for Legionella risk assessments. These records should be easily available. And this is a slide that's emphasised in the L8, and this is where the duty holder must ensure that the person who carries out the risk assessment and provides advice on prevention and control of exposure must be competent to do so. So this is highlighted in the approved code of practice L8 that it's beholden upon the duty holder and obviously that water safety group, the management team, to ensure that the people who carry out the risk assessments are competent. And this is the two sort of UCAS accredited bodies and the Legionella Control Association, which it's a membership scheme, which the HCSE detail in the approved code of practice, and HSG 274 is a possible source for support. So if you've got systems in there, then my advice would be to make sure that they're on the LCA. So they've got to jump through some hoops to be on the code of conduct, to adhere to the code of conduct. And then obviously the second stage of that is to filter a little bit further down, and we already use UCAS for our laboratories, our calibrations. It goes hand in hand with making sure that the risk assessment is also UCAS accredited and conforms to the British standard, which we're talking about today. And previously, I've just talked about not being a condition survey, and it's a look at the water system, some temperatures and notes on the status of condition. This is not a risk assessment. In order to gain access, in order to assess the risk, you need to consider how the risk is currently being managed. So this is a real key. It's not just having a list of things, taking a look at things, checking that there's some temperatures right, maybe taking some samples, which again isn't part of the British standard. You don't have to take samples to prove that you're free from Legionella at that particular moment in time. It takes into consideration the appraisal of the current schema control. So what is currently happening right now? It also looks at the maintenance of the testing records. Are they adequate? Are they fit for purpose? Are they being done correctly? Is the PPMs in place? Are they being done correctly? What are the actions on that? What is a good quality report to be delivered by the person who's doing the work in order to ensure that the management team are confident that it is being managed adequately? Management responsibilities. Do people know what they're responsible for? Is anything slipping through the cracks? The appraisal of training records and competency checks. We need to ensure that the safe operation of the system. These things that are in our facilities are often bought from manufacturers, installers that are competent, that are building equipment and delivering equipment that's fit for purpose. But are the people using those pieces of equipment doing it safely and doing it properly? Because they're only adequate if they are being properly used. Appraisal of the monitoring and inspection records. So is the monitoring and inspection record sufficient? And as I mentioned before looking around the building at the water system, there's a need to look at the entire management system that drives how Legionella is being managed within the organisation or the property. And one of the key things is the competency of the RP, for example, the duty holder, the RP, the deputy RP. Have they had training? How good is their knowledge and understanding of what is required? What is their understanding of what's good or bad practice? And this lack of training of an RP can then cascade down and be reflected upon how they require the risk to be managed or not, given their lack of training, for example. So if it's driven well from the top, from the hierarchy, from the water safety group, it transcends or goes downwards into the people who are actually doing the work. And I suppose the key there is it's not a drive-by. After the desktop appraisal, there's a need to look at the risk systems within the property. So this actually requires the risk assessor to look at the current asset list and visit that item, device, system, and assess it. And it's not, as I mentioned before, it's not a drive-by. And that means that we don't just go and say, right, it's a cut and paste job. It's we've done it before. It's nothing changed, according to the RP. Maybe we've done nothing, but in essence, you may well have done something. But it's not a case of taking somebody's word for it. It's got to be out. We've got to go and assess it. We've got to go and look at it. We've got to go and check it. And again, that's the second part of the sort of final aspect of the actual report is checking that the equipment is still sound, sufficient, working correctly, and has got the relevant monitoring regime in place. And the reason why I bring that up is because we've had I've seen a risk assessment being performed on a site that had actually burnt down, and that property had burnt down, but the risk assessor had managed to be able to produce a risk assessment of it 6 months after it had burnt down. So you can clearly see there that some organisations had undertaken a desktop exercise, which was that's the risk assessment from old. I'll just put the new date on it and we'll all be okay. And we've also got to make sure that those schematics that are produced have the some schematics that are produced have the previous risk assessment data on them and are not current. Well, they've got to be current, because if you sit in front of the HSE, you've got to be able to talk through your schematic and your risk assessment. And if you've got an out-of-date schematic there, it's frowned upon by the HSE inspectors. So we also take a look at the measurements. What's routinely taken on site, for example, temperature checks, biocide levels, etc., etc. And temperature control is the traditional control strategy, and in my opinion, the best control strategy. And we need to monitor temperature, and there's some thoughts on that. And the person completing the routine checks, have they been trained? There are different types of thermometers: immersion, contact, dual, gauges on vessels, for example, BMS systems. And do they know how to use them correctly, and where to record the data? When was the thermometer checked or last calibrated? When were the gauges on vessels ever calibrated? And how reliable is that data? Do we know how to use the BMS system? Some BMS systems record data for sort of 30 days and just continually repeat and refresh. Is that adequate? And the data would provide evidence on the state of compliance. If it's not right, then false assurances are being provided. And where there is data about the efficacy of the thermometer from the desk-based appraisal, the risk assessor should be inclined to take more temperature readings to ensure that the system is working and is compliant. And as I mentioned before, testing for Legionella is not a prerequisite for a Legionella risk assessment. They are often included, but they're not a prerequisite. You don't need to undertake those Legionella risk assessments, those Legionella samples. And the British Standard 8580 details clearly when a sample might want to be taken as part of the risk assessment. And as I say there, it says testing for Legionella should be considered if any of the following occur: the risk assessor encounters a novel situation or piece of equipment perceived to be a potential risk. There's a failure of or concerns about control measures. It's necessary to verify the operation of the control regime, particularly if it's been recently changed or implemented and the system is known to have previously been colonised, or whether the assessor has reason to doubt the validity of the results of routine tests or has identified areas of concern during the survey. And British Standard 7592 details how to take a Legionella sample pre and post need and technique, for example. So again, if you do take Legionella samples, make sure that they are conforming to the British standard, and make sure that they are transferred to the UCAS accredited laboratory, who are also conforming to the UCAS accredited standard procedure for sampling and analytical techniques, but also that they are transferred to the laboratory within the right time frame, in the right temperature, etc., etc. What else does it include? Well, the LA and the British Standard 8580 don't detail a scoring method, and the British Standard 8580 details the need for a scoring matrix to be defined and included in the risk assessment. And that risk should not just be defined by the highest risk issue. So risk matrix needs to consider contamination, amplification, transmission, and exposure, for example. And then we've obviously got a risk rating system. So this is a RAG report, red, amber, green. And as touched on earlier, susceptibility of occupants needs to be considered. As such, this will impact on the risk rating. As I mentioned before, the susceptibility of the individuals is going to be greater in a care facility than it is necessarily a school. And then from a general perspective, the report should be clear and concise. Yeah, it shouldn't be pages and pages of repeating guidance and history of Legionella, for example, when the first outbreak was, when the second or the first UK outbreak was, or etc., etc. And the action plan risk minimisation scheme needs to include a priority status for the recommendations. And the deadlines for the prioritised action needs to be agreed by the RP and the water safety group. How can a risk assessor determine deadlines for an organisation? For example, they don't control the budget. They may be an opportunity to replace a certain system within the next 2 years. So they decide to manage that system rather than do the repairs or the recommendations, etc., that are on the risk assessment. So hopefully that makes a bit of sense, that those deadlines shouldn't be prioritised, they should be agreed. And obviously if the HSC do come on site and inspect and do an audit, at least you can say you've got an action plan for this, for that, for the other. This is how you're going to manage and maintain and monitor, and this is how you're going to ensure that that system is controlled and managed up until the point of repair or replacement or refurbishment or whatever. And I suppose, having completed a broad overview of what the British Standard 8580 requires from a risk assessment, some of the items discussed will or may already have the mind racing, and it would be worth looking at the content of the British Standard 8580 and completing a check or a tick to see if you comply, for example. So that's in my opinion, a great slide. Do you have that in place? Is it current? Is it up to date? Is it accurate? And the key points to take away really are: Legionella risk assessments are a requirement of regulations and guidance. The guidance details what needs to be assessed. It doesn't tell you how. And the British Standard 8580-2019 details the approach for undertaking a Legionella risk assessment. A Legionella risk assessment which meet the requirements of the British Standard 8580 look to LCA memberships. There's greater than 300 members who can complete risk assessments or Legionella risk assessments. And then for further defining or refining that search, look to UCAS accreditation, where there are only 13 companies in the UK accredited for it. And then finally, Legionella risk assessments to be completed by individuals who are independent from vested interest and who are deemed as being competent. So as I mentioned before, competency is the real driver for this, and make sure that they've got experience in the risk assessments, in the risk associated with your property, premises, organisation, for example. I've just got one more bit updates from the BSI 2022 for Pseudomonas aeruginosa risk assessments. Again, consultation doc was out, and that's been pushed through, if I remember right. And the British Standard 7592 consultation doc out at present, and BSI are looking to issue it in 2022. And again, I think that's been pushed out, but I'd have to double check that bit of information there. And then finally, we've got followers to receive weekly logs on the management and control of water hygiene and Legionella disease. We've got our academy videos of how to take temperature monitoring, Legionella sampling and flushing of little used outlets. And we produce blogs from our authorising engineers, senior consultants, who are being asked by specific clients or prospects to talk about specific things that may be of interest to you. So it's not a sales platform. It's more informative, and is trying again increase that 10% of industry knowledge or people knowledge to get that slightly greater and have an understanding of waterborne pathogens. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank you for listening to me. I know it's not the sexiest of subjects, but it is important, and I've hopefully made it semi-interesting. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, that's great. Thank you very much, Pete, and everybody at the Water Hygiene Centre. Really interesting, and as you say, some food for thought. And I've certainly taken away some bits and pieces that I want to do a bit more investigation on and find out a bit more about. So you may find me being in touch in the very near future. But so the recording of today's event will be available on YouTube for anybody that wants to catch up. And or share with colleagues that weren't able to attend. There is another chance to watch and learn and engage later on today. CPD certificates will be circulated automatically once I've checked everybody in via the app, which I'll do in a moment. Details of future events can be found on our Eventbrite page. There's a link in the chat. And any feedback, thoughts and comments would be welcome by emailing feedback@cibsewm.org. Pete, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank you very much again, and all your colleagues at Water Hygiene Centre. And I'd like to thank everybody for attending today as well. Thank you very much. Great to see you and have so many people wanting to find out more about water risk assessments. There's lots of thanks in the chat, Pete, for today's session. So not sure whether you're reviewing those, but plenty of thanks coming in.
Sorry, I'll just stop sharing and I will just take a look at the chat.
There's no other. There was a question asking whether the slides can be made available afterwards, which hopefully won't be will be possible to do. I thank you once again and look forward to welcoming everybody at a future event by CIBSE West Midlands region. So thank you all and have a good day.
Perfect. Thanks for having me.